Well, first, I have to disagree with this language. I deal with that at the UN every day when people spread lies so easily, blood libels,
Well, these are former
crimes,
prime ministers of
genocide.
Israel, with all due respect. I mean, they're not exactly people who you would normally expect to accuse Israel of war crimes.
He was prime minister 20 years ago, and he's bitter, and he doesn't like the current government, but not only from the inside. Tom Fletcher, a senior diplomat here at the UN, claimed that 14,000 babies will die within 48 hours.
Yeah, he made a terrible mistake. That was a stupid thing to say, and he made a terrible mistake for which he's apologised.
Yeah, but he didn't apologize for claiming there is a genocide in Gaza. So people, spread those lies, and then sometimes they retract it, sometimes they don't, and we have to deal with the consequences, with the incitement. So yes, I agree with you. There is suffering in Gaza. I agree with you. It is painful for Israelis and Palestinians. But let's, stick to international law. Let's look at the facts. We are doing our best, even now when we are in the middle of a war with Iran. Today, the centers in Gaza were operated, the humanitarian fund, and 4 centers delivered tens of thousands of packages to Palestinians. So I think we should look at the facts and to understand that we still have hostages in Gaza, and this conflict will end with the hostages coming home and Hamas getting out of Gaza. Maybe they will be deported like what happened in Lebanon in the 80s with the PLO. Maybe they will surrender, but I think that will be the end of this conflict.
And why haven't you let the journalists in?
Well, first of all, today you have access, you have Wi-Fi, you can see everything that happens in Gaza. You have reporters inside Gaza for all agencies that support. For us to take responsibility for people coming in and out in a war zone, it's something we don't feel comfortable with.
I don't think you need to. Listen, all I know is, with all due respect, Ambassador, is that very soon after October the 7th, Israel's government instructed the IDF to take the world's journalists to the scene of the appalling crimes of terrorism that were committed in Israel. But when it comes to what is going on in Gaza, there's been an almost total ban on any international journalists. And with all due respect, it's not your concern whether international journalists will be at risk or not. That's the risk assessment of their own companies who employ them, as it is in any war zone. You should allow them in. And then this whole question of whether Israel is operating within the law or not can actually be established by independent journalists coming from around the world. And until you do that, it's going to raise the obvious suspicion that you're doing things you don't want the world to know.
Well, it's a legitimate debate, but, just imagine what would happen, God forbid, one of the journalists will die.
Well, nearly 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed. So it's not unusual for journalists to be dying.
I have to beg with you also, I don't buy those numbers, also when you
well, you don't buy any of the numbers, but that's the problem. Again, all due respect, Ambassador, Israel can now just say that you don't buy any of the numbers because they're all supplied by the Palestinians.
Well, when it comes from Hamas,
I know where it comes from.
I don't buy any numbers.
Yes, but you also know that in previous...
When it comes from Hamas, I don't buy it.
Right, but historically, in this conflict, going back decades, actually, the Palestinian Health Authority numbers for casualties have turned out to be broadly accurate after the event. So it's only in this particular flare-up, this particular war, as part of the ongoing conflict, that suddenly Israel's government is saying you can't believe any of the numbers. To which, again, I simply say there's a very easy way to verify this stuff. Let in the journalists.
No, we saw that those numbers that were exaggerated from the beginning. They were used by Hamas for propaganda. And I agree with you. It's hard to find out the exact numbers, but, when you read those numbers, you ask yourselves, so where are the Hamas terrorists? They didn't die in this conflict. They claim they were all civilians, were all children. We know it's exaggerated. But you know what? I agree with you that there is suffering in Gaza and there is casualties in Gaza. But the blame is on Hamas, it's not on us. We can end this war tomorrow. If they would release the hostages, lay down the weapons, maybe get out of Gaza, and then we can think about a future for the region.
It's interesting.
The sooner it will happen, the better it will be.
Yeah, look, it's interesting to me that as somebody that supported Israel's right to defend itself after the appalling events of October the 7th, those terrible terror attacks, and I did so for many, many months, but as I become increasingly critical of Israel's government strategy in Gaza, and so have many other people, including many of your allies, that at the same time you've got a lot of broad support for what you're doing with Iran, because people understand that Iran has become this kind of fulcrum of terrorism in the Middle East. We have to draw close to our interview, but it does, again, beg the question, if the IDF had been more targeted in conjunction with Mossad in going after Hamas, rather than just levelling Gaza to the ground and killing tens of thousands of civilians as it went after Hamas, if it had been as targeted or as smart as it was with Hezbollah and now in Iran, you may have had a lot more support than you're currently getting for what you're doing in Gaza.
Probably you're right, but I want to add one point. It's much harder to deal with a terrorist organization that hide among civilians and use them as a human shield. That's why this war is very long, 20 months, it's a very long war for us. It's different, it's easier to fight a military or to fight another state than to fight a terror organization which is, so involved with the civilians in Gaza. So it's much more challenging. But I hope that the people in Hamas understand that we are determined, and hopefully in the next few days they will accept the framework that the US put on the table, and we can move forward to see a ceasefire and the release of more hostages.
Ambassador Danon, I appreciate you coming back on Uncensored. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's go to the panel. Cenk, I could see you reacting pretty violently to what you were hearing there. So what is your response to what you heard from the ambassador?
Yeah, when Israeli officials speak, it's like they're in fantasy land. They leveled Gaza. And the reason that they leveled Gaza is because they're going to take Gaza. And that's not speculation anymore. When those of us who were opposed to their war crimes and genocide said they were going to take Gaza, that it had nothing to do with self-defense, it had to do with land acquisition, as all the wars that Israel starts has to do with. They said, oh, that's anti-Semitic, how dare you? Now their cabinet has said, yeah, we're going to take Gaza. It's a conquest. So now they've started another offensive war in Iran. They'll pretend to be the victims. That's what they always do. Oh, my God, so I had to start a war for self-defense. Nonsense, garbage. Just like you said, 33 years, they even say any day now Iran's going to have nukes. It was a lie. Netanyahu went on Fox News over the weekend, admitted they weren't even close to having it within a year. Then they said, oh, it's because of ballistic missiles. The ambassador there again referred to the ballistic missiles. An incredible number of countries have ballistic missiles. Is Israel going to attack all of them? Is Israel going to invade all of them and then pretend that it's self-defense? How many? And then they talk about, oh, we try so hard to not have civilian deaths, and then American media plays along. No, they killed hundreds of civilians in Tehran. So they always kill civilians. They always kill more civilians than their opponents while pretending that they care so much about civilians. They're the ones starting all the wars. We all have eyes and ears. We just saw them start this war. And every time American media plays along and pretends that there's a fantasy land where Israel's the victim, and they, oh my God, they just had to attack yet another Middle Eastern neighbor. They just had to take Gaza. So almost when you hear an Israeli official speaking, they're lying. They're lying almost 100% of the time.
I mean, I'm going to come to Ben Ferguson to respond. All I would say is, clearly, when you have the leader of Iran, the Ayatollah, who's gone on record as saying he wants to get rid of Israel, and when you have Hamas in Gaza, who are also wedded to getting rid of Israel, it's not completely irrational that they would feel that they are under threat. Now, you and I have debated a lot the way they've gone about things in Gaza. It's markedly different how they've gone about things in Iran and with Hezbollah. But I don't think we can pretend that Israel is not under threat from either Iran or Hamas. Ben Ferguson.
Yeah, what he just said omitted one massive aspect of the conversation. There was an attack on Israel. There was the kidnapping and the torturing and the raping and the murdering of innocent people that were gathering to have a fun weekend. The idea that he is forgetting what happened on October 7th and acting like Israel just woke up on a random Tuesday and decided to start attacking Gaza is absolute anti-Semitic insanity. We know what started this. And the second part of this, he says, hey, are they going to attack everybody in the world that has ballistic missiles? I lock my doors at my house every night for the people that might be right outside of my house. And you have someone that is saying, we want to annihilate you from the river of the sea and chants death to Israel, and says they want to murder you because you are Jewish, and to act as if they don't have a right to defend themselves, and to attack Gaza after you have a massive terrorist network, an underground tunnel system that allows for them to go after you every single night, where you have to have an iron dome to protect and defend. So everything you just said, with all due respect, is absolute propaganda for the terrorists, because you admitted the fact that Israel was attacked first, that started the whole damn thing.
Okay.
No.
Matthew Said.
No, that's not.
Hang on, Chuck.
What I heard was propaganda for a terrorist just now from Ben, the terrorist state of Israel, who's been occupying the
who planned the attack and who supported the attack on October 7th.
Why don't you let them go? Why don't you let a foreign people go? How much do you want to oppress and humiliate and murder them? Now you're going to murder Iranians. And by the way, Ben, I think you forgot. You're an American, not an Israeli. Act like an American, not an Israeli. What are you, a foreign agent? Why are you working for a foreign government? Why don't you care about American interests?
I don't work for a foreign government.
We got no interest in this war.
All right.
I have an interest in people being able to live a life without fear of bombs coming into their backyard, hitting their apartments, hitting their homes from a terrorist organization. Iran is a part of that,
Gaza,
and you know it.
And all of the Middle Eastern neighbors of Israel. They live in fear of Israel, the terrorist state attacking
Israel
them 24/7.
doesn't go on the
all
offensive.
Israel
They
ever does is attack their neighbors and take their land.
All right. Time out.
Why did you admit the?
There's
I
absolutely
have one
no
question for you.
about it.
Sing. I've known you for a long time. One question. Why did you admit in your opening statement that Israel was attacked on October the 7th? Why did you not mention it one time? Because that is the fact that you cannot bring up, because that is what started the catalyst of where we are today. You know it, so you didn't mention it because you want to indict Israel, acting like Israel woke up and decided to start attacking people. It's bullshit.
All right, listen, I do want to let the other two panelists come in. Jake, you'll get a chance to come back.
58 years of brutal occupation, and you think it started on October 7th?
Let's not go back to the whole 75
years. Later, you're still murdering Palestinians, still murdering Palestinian children for sport.
Gentlemen, there are four panelists, please.
So, okay, you love genocide,
right,
I got it.
There are four panelists, guys, there are four panelists. You can come back on in a second and have further thoughts. Matthew Said, you wrote a great column at the weekend. And you were talking, and I thought it was very striking to me, about the difference between Vladimir Putin rattling his nuclear saber, because, as you pointed out, he's an extremely materialistic guy who's amassed hundreds of billions of illicit gains at the expense of his people. And he's the last person that would want to actually die for his country by pressing nuclear buttons, which would lead to his immediate vaporization. I've been saying that for ages. However, it is a different thing when it comes to Iran. There will be people there with very fundamentalist ideals who might think, if they're cornered, who might think if there's nothing else they think can get them through, who might think nothing of using a nuclear weapon if it came to it. And with the same kind of nihilistic attitude that we saw from Al-Qaeda, that we saw from ISIS and so on.
That's right. I mean, just a couple of quick points. Firstly, I like to think of myself as broadly pro-Israel, but I think, like you, feel that the destruction that has been visited upon Gaza is a moral, political and strategic calamity. When it comes to Iran, the reason I think that the logic of nuclear deterrence won't work is because they are, many of them in the regime, religious fanatics. They believe they have absolute truth. And the psychology of that is very interesting. It means that anyone who doesn't subscribe to their truth is an infidel and that they are wrong. And they glorify martyrdom and believe that if they can take down infidels, they will go through a door into paradise where they will be blessed forever. And I grew up in the 1980s. My father was born as a Shia Muslim, and I followed the Iran-Iraq war extremely closely. And viewers might be interested that the clerics, the fanatics who took over after the 79 revolution, indoctrinated young, innocent children that they were supposed to protect and asked them to walk and often run into minefields and blow themselves up. And they were then depicted in government propaganda as heroes, their limbs strewn across battlefields that many of us have now forgotten about. That, to me, is a death cult of great danger not just to Israel, but to their own people. Because if they acquire a nuclear weapon and they visit one upon Israel, as they have claimed they would do, Ahmadinejad said Israel must be wiped from the pages of history. The supreme leader described it as a cancer. Call me old-fashioned, but I take these people's words. I take them at their word, if I can put it that way. But also a danger to the Iranian people who would die in a counterstrike. And by the way, my views of the regime in Iran are corroborated by 70% of the Iranian people, a fantastic people, an ancient civilization, most of whom have been immiserated by this regime that has also destabilized the wider region through proxies and Hamas and Hezbollah. And as you say, Hamas is genocidal too. So one can have, I think, an approach of saying, yeah, Israel have got things wrong. Of course they have. The person who was on before the ambassador doesn't seem to be able to admit that. But my goodness, when Israel goes after the regime in Tehran, not the Iranian people, the regime, I think all right-minded people should support it wholeheartedly.